another. And so here the series Ask the Question. I believe if we will just ask this one question, it's going to save us a lot of heartache, a lot of grief, and I believe that it'll help us in just about every one of our major life decisions. Here is the question, and by now you should know what it is, but we're going to put it up there and we're going to say it together. Here's the question. What's the wise thing to do? Let's say that together. What's the wise thing to do? That doesn't mean you have to be a wise guy, but it means what's the wise thing to do in my circumstance, in my situation? All right, so what's the wise thing to do? And then that was the basic question, but then we kind of broadened it out a little bit. It made it have a little more depth to it. And so we came up with this statement. In light of my past experience, my current circumstances, and future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? In light of your past, your present, or your current, and in light of your future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? In light of your past, because your past is your past, and my past is my past. So in light of what I have experienced, what's the wise thing to do? Your circumstances right now may be totally different from somebody else. And so just because you might be the same age or might have the same job or might have the same, I was going to say wife, but that would not be good. But you might find yourself married today, all right? And you might find a lot of your things are very similar in life, but you know what? Your life is your life. So you need to base your decisions on your life. What in light of my life, where I'm at right now, what's the wise thing to do? In light of my future, nobody cares about your future more than you do. Nobody's going to say, hey, I got to, except for God. You're the one that's most interested in you. So in light of your future, what is the wise thing to do? So now every week I've been giving an assignment about, whenever we're faced with a decision, we need to ask the question, what's the wise thing to do? In light of my past, present, and future, what's the wise thing to do? And I've said again and again that if you will do that, you will discover some things about yourself. Because sometimes you answer the question and you don't like the answer you gave yourself because you sound like your mom. Or you sound like your dad, or you sound like your husband or wife. Right? Or your mom and dad, right? And you go, I don't kind of like that. But you owe it to yourself to ask the question just so you know yourself a little better. So, here we go. We're going to get into our topic of what kind of questions in what area of life. We've talked about a lot of different areas so far, and I encouraged those last week. We got a subject today that maybe is a little more adultish in that sense, but let me ask you a question. Isn't it true that when you're tempted to do something you shouldn't do, that you tend to have a conversation with yourself? I know I shouldn't, but... And this conversation kind of goes on in your mind when you're tempted to do something that you shouldn't do. And I want you to think back. Think about your greatest regret in life for a moment. We're not going to dwell on it, but I want you to think about that. Most of the time, those decisions, you didn't just wake up one day and find yourself in that situation. That situation that you regretted, normally it's a process. That you made one decision that led to another decision that led to another decision, and all of a sudden you found yourself there. You didn't just wake up in it, and you looked at the situation, you made a decision and saw what you were going to do, right? It didn't just sort of sneak up on you. Is that you in your mind you're probably thinking, well, I probably shouldn't do this, I shouldn't go there, I shouldn't stay, I shouldn't whatever. You pretty much knew what you were going to do before you even started it. So, and we all do it. We start talking ourselves into dumb decisions, into bad choices, and you look back and you go, oh, man, how could I have been so stupid? Why didn't I see that coming? And you were there the whole time having the conversation. It's not like you were having an out-of-body experience. It was going on in your mind. And here's how we do it. Here's how we come to those places. We go into the conversation saying something like this, well, there's nothing wrong with. There's nothing wrong with that, and the next thing you know, we've done something wrong, and we go, well, man, that was really wrong. Why did I do that? But all the way, right up to the line that we crossed over and did that thing, we had these thoughts. And we kept making excuse after excuse for it, and so that's something we've all learned. And here's the assumption that I want us to, I was telling Alicia about this yesterday as we were kind of talking just a moment about what we were going to be talking about today. But how many of you have learned that just because something isn't wrong doesn't make it right? Just because something isn't wrong doesn't make it right. How many of you think that maybe is a good statement? It may be right for somebody else, but it may not be right for you. So if you're a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and you've been commanded in the New Testament to live above, simply living above what is right and what is wrong. Life isn't about just right and wrong, do this, don't do that. But we've been commanded to ask a better question. And that is this question. Ask the better question, not is it right or is it wrong, but is it wise? Not is it right or is it wrong, but is it wise? Is it a wise thing to do? Because you can get yourself out of a lot of troubles doing things that just aren't wrong. If you're not a Christian or you don't follow Jesus, we've all been invited to ask this question. Is it the wise thing to do? Instead of, just making excuses and saying, well, there's nothing wrong with, we should be asking the question, in light of my past, my present, my future, what's the wise thing to do? And today we're going to be talking about this in light of our moral decisions. Our moral decisions, especially as it pertains to our sexuality and our expressions of sexuality, whether you're dating or married or somewhere in between, whether you're divorced or somebody, who has a straight lifestyle or a gay lifestyle, doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, because anything to do with your sexuality, we're going to apply the question to it. And frankly, it might be a little uncomfortable, but you know what? We're all big people here, and we can talk about these things, because here's what I know. Too many times in churches, we ignore hard things. And I think if there's a place that we need to talk about hard things, this ought to be a place that we can talk about them and be safe about it and say, you know what? God has something to say about it, because he created us this way. He created us to be sex and sexuality. He made us that way, and he says, I want you to enjoy it. And so here's some guidelines. Here's some things that's going to make you live without the regret of having made unwise decisions. So we're just going to get into it today and see where God takes us, all right? So let's pray. Father, I thank you that you love us so much, that you give us truth and you give us wisdom. You're the source of wisdom, God. We can learn things, but ultimately, God, it's you that supplies wisdom to us. And I pray that as we talk about this today, that you will help us to receive something new for ourselves, and that will change our heart, perhaps from following more toward our own way and our own heart to following your heart today. Because if we follow that, then we're going to find that our life is full of much less regret and turmoil. And we thank you for it. I pray for clarity of speech and thought as I bring what you've laid on my heart for your people today. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So here's what we know. Bad moral decisions are generally preceded by a series of unwise decisions. A series of unwise. But let's clarify that phrase for a second. What is bad moral? Because it isn't just a Christian phrase, because I think everybody, with very few exceptions, I think everybody has sort of an inherent sense of what is right and what is wrong. I think inside of us, there is a sense of this is right and this is wrong. And so if you're a person wanting to follow after the heart of Jesus, that means something pretty specific for us, because the Bible gives very clear standards when it comes to our sexuality. But if you're not, then I want to just challenge you to look back on your life, and if you feel a sense of regret over things you involved yourself with sexually, then that's what I'm talking about today. The bad moral choice. And so you can define bad however you want to, but define it in some way for yourself today. So, like I said, bad moral decisions usually follow a series of unwise decisions, because that's the way the world works. Your greatest regret morally was probably preceded by a series of unwise decisions. Most likely. For some of you, that might go back to high school, and maybe, any of you, I don't know, I went on spring break a couple times while I was in college, and maybe you were thinking about, back in high school, and your mom said, I don't think you should go with them on spring break, and you wanted to do that, or you wanted to go to the movie, but we're thinking about going on spring break here, and you said, well, and she says, I don't think you really should go, and you're like, well, what's wrong with it? And she says, it's not that it's wrong, I just don't think you should go. And so you're like, well, tell me, why is it wrong? But you went anyway, and then you get down there and you discover that, in fact, there weren't 2 hotel rooms that you were going to be staying in. All of a sudden you find there's just 1 hotel room. And now you're confronted with a question. What am I going to do now? And while you're doing that, and then you find out the other people are going, well, we really never planned on having 2 hotel rooms. We just told that to our parents so that we could go on this trip, right? And so you found yourself in that place. And then you get yourself in a situation, and then the decision makes, and then the next decision, the next decision, and at the end of the series of bad questions, maybe something happened. And you found yourself in a place where you go, man, how did I let myself get into this thing? How did we get there? Well, oftentimes it begins with this thought. There's nothing wrong with. There's nothing wrong with having lunch with her or him. Nothing wrong because, people have lunch or dinner all the time. Nothing wrong with dinner, right? Person's got to eat. Right? Nothing wrong with working late in the office together, right? People work late at the office. They put in long hours. Nothing wrong with working late at the office. There's nothing wrong with confiding in a person. I mean, things are kind of tough at home, and maybe marriage is kind of having some challenges or something like that. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with confiding in a friend, right? It's okay. Isn't it okay to confide in a friend, to do those things? And besides, if I were to go into premarital counseling, or not premarital, but marital counseling, that's going to cost money. And you know what? If I can just confide in somebody else, I'm going to be a good steward of my money. Because I just, I'm saving. Look at me, I'm being thrifty. And find myself confiding in a friend. And on the other end of it, I'm just a shoulder to cry on. I'm a good listener. I'm just listening. There's nothing wrong with just listening, is there? Nothing bad with just dropping by, seeing how you're doing. It's like when you're watching TV, and the guy shows up at the front door, and the conversations go on, and she doesn't really like him all that much, and he's just kind of standing there leaning at the door, and they're just carrying on the conversation, and if the guy's kind of a jerk, that, having watched the TV series. None of you watch TV series like that. I mean, I'm just saying, I've seen an episode like that in a TV series. I know y'all are better than that. But here I am, and he's standing at the door, and you're just going, man, he's a jerk, don't do it, right? And next thing you know, he walks in the door, and it blacks out. And you're like, and if it's like the end of a season thing, it's the cliffhanger. So they leave you waiting for 3 or 4 months before you even get the answer to what was really going on. You want to say to them, don't do it, but it's too late, and And next thing you know, you got to wait a whole week to find out what's going on or what's going to happen. Now let's take it and make that a little more personal. Isn't it something on television? This is a friend of yours. This is somebody that you know, and you're watching the same scenarios sort of start to play out. You heard, oh yeah, they went out to lunch or went out to dinner or found out they were working late and everybody else was gone and you knew it was just the two of them and so you're like, man, I feel like I need to say something. So you kind of bring it up to the person and go, hey, what do you, and what do they say? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. And you're thinking, no, you're right. There's nothing wrong with it, but it just doesn't seem right. It seems like maybe it's not the wise thing to do. And then you find out that they're sort of getting into each other's personal life, and you're watching this, and you're watching the whole drama. Any of you, I won't ask you, you've seen it at the workplace. I think I have. And all of a sudden it's drama. The drama of this, and that's why, a lot of places I've worked, they said no relationships at work, and they, but people still sort of sneak around and do stuff. And this whole thing just sort of starts, sort of building, and you're saying, hey, you know what you're doing? And they say, we don't care. Right? It's none of your business. There's nothing wrong with this. Nothing wrong, yeah. Well, we haven't crossed the line. But you just have a sense that they're making a series of unwise decisions that's going to take them somewhere that they need not to be. Or how about, let's bring it one step closer to home. It's you. And you're the one who's like, well, nothing's wrong. And you know what you're doing. You're lying to yourself, first of all. And you lie to everybody else that brings it up. But before you lie to everybody else, you're dishonest with yourself. And you're not open and transparent with anybody else because you're not transparent and open with yourself. And you have a hard time admitting what anybody on the outside can see happening. And you're in the process of making a bad moral decision. And you're getting closer and closer to the edge. And you know what the edge does. The edge is here, and then the edge. And then it goes, whoosh, right? And you're thinking, you know what, I still got one good foot on solid ground over here. I haven't done anything. The edge keeps getting closer and closer. And someone says, hold on, watch out. You're right, you haven't done anything yet, but they see where it's going. Now, if you're counting calories, get off that subject for a minute. Counting calories, living on the edge is okay, right? If you have a 2,000 calorie diet that you're supposed to maintain, go ahead and eat 2,000 calories. You can live on the edge when it comes to counting calories. If you, kids, students, whoever, you got a curfew at midnight, then go ahead and stay out till midnight. Do what you're doing. Enjoy it. Be there. Take advantage of it. You're supposed to be at work at 8 in the morning. Don't show up at 7. Right? It's okay to not live on the edge. You can live on the edge when it comes to work. You get there at 8, then be there at 8. Right? Don't show up at 7:30 unless they say, hey, you need to be here at 7:30, right? There are some things where you can take things up to the edge and it's okay. If you got a budget and you have a category for clothes and you say, this is how much I can spend on clothes, then go ahead and spend it. You've budgeted for it. Go ahead and spend it. You don't have to deprive yourself of those things. That's why the budget is there. It's there to help set a limit on those things. But there's areas in our life that it's fine to live on the edge. Because let's face it, if you eat an extra 50 calories, it's not a big deal. If you spend an extra $20 on food this week, probably not going to be the end of the world. If you stay out 10 minutes after the curfew, there might be some consequence, but you know your parents and you're probably going to be able to work it out, right? So in some areas, it's okay. It's no big deal. But when it comes to moral things and relational things and expressions of our sexuality, there are lines. And once you cross them, it creates just regret and oftentimes just it's complex, and it just creates all sorts of problems that you just don't want to have. And we all have whether it's you or somebody else, we all have a story or 2 or 12 or something like that. And so with all of that in mind, I want you to know today that there is a God who loves you. A God who says this in the Old Testament. He says, I have a future for you. He loves you so much, he says, I have a future for you. He says, I know your name and I care about you. That's the kind of God that wants us to relate to him. And this may not be a good picture for some of you, but it's the picture that he gives us. He is like a father. He is like a father, and he cares for his children just like us as parents care for our children, significantly and exponentially better because he's perfect and we're not. But that's the picture that he gives. He says, I know you. I have a plan for you. I know your name. I have a future for you. And so if we have a God like that, what would we expect him to say about this subject of sexuality or intimacy or things like that? Would we hear him say, just go for it? Would we expect him to say that? Would we expect him to say, just get up to the edge? No, I don't think so. We would expect him to say what any good parent would say to their 17-year-old daughter or son and say, hey, not so close. Don't get so close. And that's what God did. And he gave us some verses. There are people, the Apostle Paul, he was writing to some Christians in a city named Corinth. Corinth is a major metropolitan area, and it's a port city in Greece. And he's writing to a group it's a very pagan, they were into idol worshiping and all this kind of stuff. And he's writing to this culture. And if you go through and you know anything much about Corinth, you read that there's stuff going on, especially in the first letter that he writes, 1 Corinthians. He wrote several letters, but we're looking at the first one today. And he says, there was stuff going on in a church by people who were claiming to know Jesus and wanting to serve Jesus and wanting to love Jesus. There was stuff going on in their church that you aren't even supposed to be talking about in church. But it was going on there. And it's a very secular sort of audience that he's talking to that believe Jesus is the Son of God, that he rose from the dead, and that he's their Savior. And they're trying to figure out, how do I change over from living like a pagan to living like a Christian? Because they'd been raised in this thing, had been brought up in this thing, and here's some of the things that they would have seen. They grew up in a place where going to a temple where prostitution was encouraged. That was part of their culture. They had seen that all of their years growing up. And now Paul's saying, well, I don't think that that's a good thing. And so everybody there is just sort of trying to figure it out. And Paul's writing this audience in a culture that really is very reminiscent of our culture, isn't it? We live in a day, we don't have temples where people go and prostitute themselves or anything like that. But how many of you know we live in a sexually charged culture? We live in that kind of a society, and we see it in the movies, we see it on TV, we see it in all sorts of forms and fashion. So when we look at what Paul's saying, we really can say, you know what, their culture isn't all that much different than ours. So he says, how am I going to tell these Christians that if you do that, you're just going to hurt yourself? And so here's what he says, and I believe they're inspired by God. He says this in 1 Corinthians 6:18. He says, flee from sexual immorality. Flee from sexuality. In other words, don't flirt with it. Don't see how close you can get to whatever it is. Don't see how close you can get to this without having this happen. Don't flee. This word flee in some of your translations says run. Run away from it. And that's what it really means. It's get away from it, run as far and as fast away from it as you possibly can. I think that is something that we can all agree on. Wherever you find yourself in your faith journey, I think this is what every husband wants his wife to do. I think this is what every wife wants her husband to do. I think this is what everybody in a serious relationship wants their partner to do, what every parent wants their son and their daughter to do, right? I think this is a good thing. In fact, I think it's what every older sibling, let's take a 17-year-old son wants for his 12-year-old sister. Get away from it. Run away from it. Because there is a sense of it that just says, you know what, that's not right. I don't want that. Don't get that close to the line. Because we know this is good for the people we love, but sometimes we're not so sure that it's good for us. Sometimes, do as I say, not as I do. It's not good for you. The truth is, the Apostle Paul says something that it took psychologists and therapists thousands of years to figure out. He says, flee from sexual immorality. Why? Because all other sins a person commits are totally different than this. It's a whole other category because every other sin a person commits is outside the body. But a person who sins sexually sin against their own body. He says there's nothing like it. Lying, bad, but it's nothing like this. Stealing, bad, but it's nothing like this. It's not because that these sins this is a worse sin than any other sin, but they're unique in the way that it impacts us. All sin is wrong. However you want to define sin, and we'll talk about that perhaps. In fact, however you want to define sinful or immoral is, you'll find that the ones that are most impactful to your life are the ones that involve sexuality, sexual relations, where it's involved, because they tend to stick around with us. They tend to stay in our brain. And the truth is, we live in a culture like Paul's that thinks sex and sexuality is just physical, but eventually we realize and we say, you know what? I don't think it's just physical. I think there's more to this because it hits me deeper. It goes down deeper inside my gut. And it lingers in my mind, and I just can't get away from that. It somehow has affected my soul and my heart, my conscience, the way I view myself, the way I view women, the way I view men, the way I view others. It just changes because it's something that is deep-rooted inside of us. Because when that thing comes up, all of a sudden we're taken back to high school. All that thing we're taken back to college, and so we see that it's just bigger than that. And you don't have to read the Bible to figure that out because you just go back to things in your past, and you go, man, I remember that thing. So what does he say? When it comes to morality and things of sexual, flee, run away from, stay as far back as you can from anything immoral. Not because it's not forgivable, because it has nothing to do forgiveness. Sexual sin has nothing to do with, it's not like, hey, there's all these sins and then there's this one. Because in God's eye, he sees it all the same. In fact, in the New Testament, we find a story of a woman who Jesus encounters. Who it's recorded that she was brought before him because she was caught in the very act of adultery. She's brought and she's thrown before him, and here's the accusers around him and around her. And according to the law of that time that they were under, she deserved to be stoned to death because that was the law that they lived under at that time. And maybe you're familiar with the story, and all of a sudden Jesus starts writing some things down. And so what does he do? He extends grace to her. He extends forgiveness to her. He says, I don't condemn you, but don't do it again. I love you and accept you unconditionally, and I love you so much, I got to tell you something that's important. Stop doing it. Stop doing it. And I think that of all the things in our lives that we have the hardest time forgiving ourselves for, oftentimes it's those things. How could I ever go back? How could I ever, man. And we need to be able to extend forgiveness and grace to ourselves just as often. So God, who loves you and is not against you, says when it comes to this, don't allow a series of unwise decisions that you defend by saying there's nothing wrong with, get you to the place where you step over the line, and potentially in your heart and conscience and maybe physically, and it'll be there for the rest of your life. Don't go there. The issue isn't forgiveness. The issue is consequence. The issue is consequence. God will forgive you, but how many of you know sometimes when you do things, you can get forgiveness, but sometimes there's a price to be paid. There's a consequence to our actions. So at the end of this, Paul takes us up just a little bit higher, and he says, when it comes to morality, when it comes to immorality, whether you're single or married or whatever, you're a teenager or you're coming out of a second marriage or a third marriage or just got out of marriage, it doesn't matter. Here's the standard that God followers need to say. I want to follow Jesus. People who want to follow Jesus should live with and follow this thing. Honor God with your body. Honor God with your body. And the truth is, just a little buddy, this is not just about, sex. This can be about drugs. It can be alcohol. It can be about so many things, because honor God with your body. But today we're dealing with this one. It's such a different standard than saying, well, is there anything wrong with it? Is there a law against it? We'll get caught. Is there a consequence? Is anybody going to get pregnant? Paul says you don't want to live life like that, because you know where that leads. You're dancing a dangerous line, and ultimately you're going to hurt yourself. But I have a better standard. I have a better way for you if you will live it. What if the new sort of filter for our sexual expression was, will this be honoring to God? What if that was the filter that we've put that thing through? Will it be honoring God? If you spent the next year asking that question when it comes to everything dealing with moral things or sexual things, do you think that you would have more or fewer regrets? Think about that for a second. If you just took the time to ask that question, do you think you would have more regrets or less regrets? Do you think you'd be more unhealthy or more healthy? Do you think that you would view yourself in more healthy ways or in less healthy ways? Do you think your relationships would be healthier or unhealthier if you simply asked the question, will this be honoring to God? I believe this is a truth, and I forget who, I read this somewhere about relationships, and this is what he said. He said, you'll never be happier than what your relationships are. You'll never be happier than what your relationships are. And nothing complicates a relationship than sexualizing it. Nothing does more damage to that. And because God loves you, he says, I want you just to step back and ask the hard question. What's the wise thing to do? How do I honor God with my body, instead of asking, how close can I get? How close can I get? And you want to know why this is so hard for us? Why this is so challenging? Because our culture baits us to the edge of disaster morally, and then gets all over us when we cross the line. Have you ever noticed that? Think about it. Every single television show, every movie, every book, every magazine, every theme, there's always seems to be some, you can't hardly watch a Dorito commercial without something being on there that's saying, really, beautiful women in not much clothing eat Doritos. And if you eat Doritos, you'll get women like that, right? Or guys like that. And there's a reason. Remember the Old Spice commercial, ladies? And, they got the guy on the white horse. And this year they made it into a Tide commercial. It was very funny at the Super Bowl. But, our culture is just inundated with it. The way we're supposed to dress, the way we're supposed to act, the way we're supposed to dance or drink or whatever. Everything in culture draws us up to the edge of immorality, however you want to define it. It leads us to the point of making terrible decisions morally, and when we step over the line, it rebukes us and said, you know what? You shouldn't act that way. You know what? She's pregnant. Man, she's such a... Did you hear what he did? Yeah, isn't that terrible? Yeah, well, you know what they did? They did what everybody on every television show and commercial and movie and book is doing, because that's what our culture is feeding them. And you're just, and they hold us to this thing, says, well, you're just supposed to entertain yourself with that. You're not actually supposed to do anything with it. But then when you go ahead and do something with it, and it's like, man, you're so wrong. And you wonder why we find ourselves in places, because our culture is feeding that. And how do we expect people to respond to that stuff? It just becomes natural. But I know you don't want to live like that. My confidence is that you don't want to live like that. And so here's the question. In light of your past experience, in light of your current circumstance, in light of your future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? When it comes to sexual expression, comes to morality, what's the wise thing for you to do? And the hardest part about that is if you find yourself living in that way, you might make it say, oh, I'm just not going to do it. But you know what? It's hard. It's hard. It's a challenge. And you might have to take some drastic measures to get you out of that place. Talking to young people or single people, perhaps now for the moment, maybe it means, you know what? I'm not going to, for the next year, you know what? I'm not going to date anybody. I'm not going to have any one-on-one relationships till I get myself settled with who I am. And we all know this. Anybody who's been in education will tell you this. The power of writing something down is valid. You say, you know what? I'm going to write it down. I will not. And I'm making a choice. When I'm confronted with this, here is my standard. Here is where I will go, and here's where I'm not going to go. So that you don't find yourself in the position of going, you know what? How did I find myself here? But if you'll just take the time to even write it down and say, you know what? I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do this. I'm confronted with this. I'm going to flee. I'm going to run away. And if you're serious about that, because I've found this true in a lot of areas of my life, as soon as you make a commitment to do something like this, I mean, the next day, something comes up, and, case in point, I made, when I was living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, still single, I had a conversation with my roommate Dave the night before I met Alicia, and I told Dave, I said, you know what, it'd be wrong for me to date a person unless I was going to marry him, because that's going to be bad. Next day, I met Alicia, and I came up into Dave's room and I said, hey Dave, you'll never believe the woman that I met tonight. He just laughed at me and says, okay, get me the wedding. Keep my invitation ready. Because as soon as you make a decision to do that, as soon as you make the decision to quit something or to start something, the next day something's going to come in your way because we have an enemy that wants to fight against us, and he will put things in your path. But in light of your future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? Maybe you just got a new haircut and you lost some weight and you're looking good, and you might not like what I'm saying. Maybe you're just lonely. And you're saying, there's nothing wrong. What's the wise thing to do? And you might be saying, well, but everybody else is. Nobody else is living that way. Nobody else is waiting around. Nobody else is stepping back from the line. Nobody else is doing that. You know what? Maybe you're right. But all you're telling me is a fact. All you're saying is a fact. What's the point? What's the point of what you're telling me? Well, nobody else is. That's not an argument. That's just a fact. That's not an excuse. You're just telling me reality. And so when you say that, what you're really saying is this: but nobody else is, and I want to be like everybody else. When you make that argument, well, everybody else is, well, then what you're really saying is everybody else is, and I want to just be like everybody else. And I would dare to say, no, you don't. You don't want to be like everybody else. You don't want a marriage like everybody else, or a second marriage, or a third marriage. You don't want the same regret as everybody else lives with, that finds themselves, that have crossed over that line. You don't want that. I just want to be like her. You don't want that. You don't want that regret. You don't want that past behind you. Because that's what everybody else is getting. They're getting the regret. They're getting the past. They're getting the hurt. They're getting the fear. They're getting all the junk that everybody else is, because you're doing what everybody else is doing. Dave Ramsey talks about it in financial things. You got to live today like nobody else, so that in the future you live like nobody else. Today you got to make a choice. I want to live today like nobody else. Everybody else is living this way, but they're all going to end up down the same path. You don't want to go there. So to say, well, I just want to be like everybody else, it's just an admission that you just want to go where everyone else is going. Nobody spends their life just trying to be an average person with an average marriage, with an average past, with average guilt, an average addiction, and average desires to go in ways that you're going to later regret in life. Nobody does that. Nobody wants that. But if you want what you say you want, then you're going to have to step back and do what very few people are doing, so that you can have the relationships that very few people enjoy. And that's just reality. So in light of your past experience, your current circumstances, and your future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? It might seem extreme, but you know what? I believe you're worth it. So don't try to justify it. Don't just lie to yourself. Don't go, oh, there's nothing wrong with. Right up to the line, flee. Flee from it. Don't dance around it. Don't flirt with it. And I believe that if you'll ask this question in this, perhaps one of the most sensitive and difficult areas of our lives, if you will do that, then I believe you'll never regret it. I don't believe you'll ever regret it. And I believe that in doing that, you're not going to be weird. We'll use a different word. You'll be unique. How many like to be unique? I'm unique. I'm unique. You're not weird. You're just unique. You're special. Sometimes people say that, he's just sort of special. Okay? But you'll be unique. You're going to stand out from the crowd. You're going to be unique because you will set yourself up for success in the most important arena of your life, in your relationships with people and relationship with a Father in heaven who loves you. Would you bow your heads with me this morning? God, this is hard sometimes. Sometimes harder for others than. And God, we need wisdom. We need wisdom to make the right choices. We need wisdom to take the words that you've spoken to us, especially concerning our sexuality and stuff, and we need to have wisdom and say, how am I going to live? Am I going to live right up the edge, or am I going to go over the edge like everybody else around me? Our culture feeds it to us, and by the truckload, it seems like. And then we act surprised when people give in to what the culture says, hey, it's okay. You can entertain yourself with it, but don't engage in it. And we wonder what happens. We see a culture filled with lives of people whose relationships have been broken and just messed up because they've gone too far. It wasn't that it was wrong to talk to somebody, but it may not have been the right thing to do. So God, I pray for courage. I pray for courage for us to do the right things. Strength to do the right thing, to go against the culture, so that we can have something better than what the culture offers us. Give us strength and courage to do the difficult things, to make the hard choices, God, even sometimes that means putting up with the sort of the taunting and the whatever that people surround us with. You mean you don't? No. Why not? What's wrong with you? Everybody. No, not everybody. I don't. I choose not to. Because I don't want that regret. I don't want that hurt. I don't want that. I want the best. So God, help us. Help us this week once again to ask ourselves the questions when the invitation comes, when the opportunity arises, when the decision needs to be made. Help us to ask the question. In light of my past experiences, my present circumstances, my future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? And help us to be honest with ourselves when we ask it, and to grow from it.